Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into an era when communication was an art form, a slow dance of ink and paper, a world where instant messages were, well, centuries away. Imagine, if you will, the soft glow of a gas lamp illuminating a polished mahogany desk. You hear the gentle scratch of a quill on thick, creamy paper, the distant clip clop of a horse drawn carriage on cobblestones, and the subtle scent of sealing wax melting over a flame. You're not scrolling through feeds, you're meticulously crafting a message, choosing every word with care, knowing it might travel for days, weeks, or even months before reaching its intended recipient. This was the peculiar, often painstaking, but undeniably charming world of Victorian letter writing. You probably won't survive this level of delayed gratification in our current fast paced world, but trust me, it's oddly soothing to consider. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these quiet stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a bustling Victorian parlor, perhaps curled up in a plush armchair, pondering the day's events. The very notion of writing a letter might seem quaint, even archaic, to your modern sensibilities, but in the 19th century, it was the absolute backbone of society, the primary way people connected across distances, shared news, conducted business, and even found love. It was the social media, the email, the text message, and the phone call all rolled into one, albeit operating at a decidedly more leisurely pace. Every letter was a tangible piece of someone's thought, a physical object that held a fragment of their time and effort. When you received a letter, you weren't just reading words. You were holding a piece of your correspondent, a small, folded window into their world. This wasn't some casual flick of the thumb on a screen. This was a deliberate, often hours long engagement. One mainstream historical fact to grasp right away is that literacy rates, while improving throughout the Victorian era, were still not universal, particularly in the earlier decades. While the upper and middle classes were expected to be proficient writers, many working class individuals might rely on others to write or read letters for them, making each piece of correspondence an even more communal and significant event. It was a shared experience, sometimes read aloud in a family setting, debated and discussed, perhaps even admired for its eloquent prose or shocking news. This wasn't just a private interaction between two people, it was often a public performance within the home, a dramatic reading of news from afar. Now, for a slightly quirky tidbit. Did you know that some Victorians, especially those in polite society, considered it quite rude to actually fold a letter if it contained sensitive or very personal information? Instead, they would carefully roll it, tie it with a ribbon, and insert it into a cylindrical container, hoping to deter curious eyes. Imagine the effort involved in unrolling such a missive, a slow reveal that built anticipation with every gentle unfurling. It adds a whole new layer to handling with care. Historians still argue whether this practice was genuinely for privacy or simply another elaborate display of Victorian etiquette and gentility, a subtle flex of one's social standing and access to specialized stationery. It certainly made casual snooping a more arduous task, adding an extra layer of physical barrier to the written word. As you settle deeper into your armchair, perhaps a faint aroma of coal smoke drifts from the fireplace. You realize that the foundation of this intricate letter writing world was a rather revolutionary innovation. Before the mid 19th century, sending mail was a chaotic and expensive affair. The cost of a letter was typically paid by the recipient, not the sender, and it varied wildly depending on the distance it traveled and the number of sheets of paper enclosed. Imagine the awkwardness. A postman arrives at your door with a letter, and you have to decide on the spot if you can afford to receive it. Many letters were refused simply because the cost was too prohibitive for the recipient, leaving both sender and receiver in limbo. It was a system ripe for change, and change it did. Enter Rowland Hill, a visionary educator and reformer who, in 1840, introduced what would become known as the penny post. This was a game changer, a true democratization of communication. For the first time, a letter could be sent anywhere within the United Kingdom for a uniform rate of just 1 penny, regardless of distance, provided it weighed under half an ounce. Crucially, the sender paid, not the recipient, through the ingenious invention of the adhesive postage stamp. Suddenly, communication became accessible to the masses, not just the privileged few. You could send a letter to your cousin across the country for the same price as sending one to your neighbor down the street. It was like switching from a pay per minute, distance based phone call to an unlimited national plan for the price of a single candy. This single reform had a profound impact. The volume of mail exploded, soaring from around 75 million letters in 1839 to over 350 million by 1850. Imagine the postal workers suddenly swamped with sacks and sacks of letters, all bearing the same small, sticky square. It created an enormous administrative challenge, but also connected families and businesses in ways previously unimaginable. The penny post wasn't just about affordability, it was about predictability and ease. You knew exactly what it would cost, and you knew your letter would arrive. This standardization was a hallmark of Victorian efficiency and innovation, pushing forward an interconnected society. A quirky tidbit related to the penny post is the very first adhesive postage stamp, the penny black, issued in May 1840. It featured a portrait of the young Queen Victoria. What's interesting is that it didn't have perforations, meaning each stamp had to be carefully cut from the sheet with scissors. Imagine the patience required to prepare your letters, snipping away at a sheet of stamps before you even put pen to paper. It wasn't until 1854 that perforations became standard, making life significantly easier for everyone involved. Historians still argue whether the initial lack of perforations was a design oversight or a deliberate cost saving measure during the stamp's experimental phase. Either way, it certainly added a layer of quaint inefficiency to the postal process. This shift meant that you, as a Victorian correspondent, were now part of a vast, unseen network. your words traveling alongside countless others, all for the princely sum of 1 penny. It transformed letter writing from a luxury into an everyday necessity, paving the way for the peculiar practices we're about to explore. With the penny post making letters affordable, your next consideration, after mastering the art of paying for postage, would be the very canvas upon which your words would rest, your stationery. This wasn't just about grabbing any old paper, it was an elaborate, often status driven decision. Imagine walking into a Victorian stationer's shop. The air would be thick with the scent of paper, ink, and leather. You'd see stacks of pristine paper, each varying in thickness, texture, and tint. There were crisp white sheets for formal correspondence, delicate pastel shades for personal notes, and even heavy, cream colored paper for important business letters. The choice of paper often signaled your social standing, your mood, and even the nature of your message. A delicate, almost translucent sheet might suggest a confessional or intimate tone, while a robust, substantial paper could convey authority and importance. Some paper had a subtle watermark, a design pressed into the paper during manufacturing, visible only when held up to the light. This was a, this was a mark of quality and authenticity, a silent seal of approval. It's a far cry from today's default white printer paper, isn't it? Every decision, from the weight of the paper to its subtle hue, carried a particular unspoken message. Then came the envelopes. Before 1840, letters were often folded and sealed without an envelope, with the address written directly on the outside. But with the advent of the penny post and standardized postage, envelopes became commonplace. They too came in a dizzying array of styles: plain white, embossed with intricate patterns, lined with colored tissue paper, or even adorned with personal monograms. Imagine selecting an envelope with a subtle floral design to send a cheerful note to a friend, or a stark black edged envelope for a somber message of condolence. The envelope wasn't just a container, it was part of the presentation, a prelude to the message within. A mainstream historical fact here is the rise of the stationery industry itself. The demand for paper, envelopes, and writing implements skyrocketed after the penny post, leading to a boom in factories and skilled craftspeople dedicated to producing these goods. This wasn't just about individual consumption, it was a significant economic driver, creating jobs and fostering innovation in printing and paper manufacturing. The Victorian era, often seen as a period of grand industrialization, had these quieter, paper based industries flourishing in its shadow. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some very elaborate Victorian stationery even came with pre printed borders or images, often pastoral scenes, floral arrangements, or even whimsical caricatures. Imagine receiving a letter on paper framed by tiny dancing bears. It adds a layer of unexpected playfulness to what we often perceive as a very prim and proper era. These weren't just for children either. Adults sometimes used them for informal correspondence, showcasing a delightful blend of formality and whimsy. Historians still argue whether the popularity of these decorative papers reflected a genuine desire for artistic expression or simply another aspect of the pervasive Victorian consumerism, encouraging people to buy more and more specialized items for every conceivable occasion. Either way, it certainly made the mail exciting. Finally, you'd choose your ink, not just black or blue, but rich sepia tones, deep greens, even vibrant purples were available, each offering a distinct character to your words. And of course, the pen itself, a quill, a dip pen with a replaceable nib, or perhaps, for the truly modern, one of the earliest fountain pens. Each choice was a deliberate act, a personal stamp on the communication about to begin. With your exquisite stationery chosen, the next hurdle in the peculiar world of Victorian letter writing was the salutation. This wasn't a casual, hey, or a quick, to whom it may concern. Oh no, the opening of your letter was a finely tuned instrument, a delicate social barometer that instantly communicated the nature of your relationship with the recipient. Imagine the pressure, knowing that a single misplaced comma or an overly familiar address could signal a social faux pas, or worse, a blatant insult. You didn't just write, you performed. The range of acceptable salutations was vast and rigidly defined. For a close family member or an intimate friend, you might use something warm and familiar like my dearest name or my darling name. But even here, there were nuances. Was it my dearest mother or simply dearest mother? The omission of my could imply a slightly less affectionate, though still loving, relationship. For a more distant acquaintance or a business contact, you'd opt for a formal Dear Sir or Madam, sometimes adding their full title if you knew it, like Dear Mr. Smith. The very formality was a sign of respect, a recognition of proper social distance. What if you were writing to someone of higher social standing, someone you deeply respected but didn't know personally? Then you might elevate your salutation to honored sir or respected madam. Each word was weighed, each phrase carefully considered, a tiny puzzle piece in the larger social mosaic of Victorian life. It was a subtle dance of deference and familiarity, performed meticulously on paper. It's a stark contrast to our modern habit of often skipping salutations entirely in texts and emails, isn't it? A mainstream historical fact about salutations is their evolution from earlier centuries. While the Victorians certainly perfected the art of the formal address, the roots of these conventions stretched back to earlier eras, influenced by legal documents, courtly correspondence, and even classical rhetoric. The Victorian period simply codified and expanded these existing practices, making them a central part of everyday communication for the burgeoning middle class. It wasn't just about what you said, but how you said it and who you were saying it to. Now for a quirky tidbit. Did you know there was a subtle distinction between my dear and dear my? While both sound affectionate, my dear was generally used for close friends and family, implying a warm, possessive familiarity. Dear my, on the other hand, was sometimes used by very close intimates, almost an inversion that suggested an even deeper, almost exclusive bond, or occasionally in a slightly condescending way to infer affection while maintaining a power dynamic. It was a tiny linguistic ripple, yet it could convey a world of meaning to a Victorian reader. Historians still argue whether this subtle difference was widely recognized and adhered to by everyone, or if it was more of a niche affectation among the upper crust. It certainly highlights the intricate layers of social coding embedded in seemingly simple phrases. This meticulous attention to the opening set the tone for the entire letter, a carefully constructed facade of politeness and propriety, even if the content within might be scandalous gossip or a passionate declaration. It was all about presentation, about creating the right first impression, even before a single meaningful word was read. With your carefully chosen salutation now gracing the top of your pristine paper, your attention would turn to the very act of putting words down. Penmanship. In the Victorian era, your handwriting wasn't just a means to an end. It was a reflection of your character, your education, and your social standing. Imagine the pressure. Every loop, every flourish, every meticulously formed letter spoke volumes about you before a single word of your actual message was even deciphered. This wasn't about speed, it was about grace, clarity, and consistency. You would likely be sitting at a sturdy writing desk, perhaps by a window to catch the natural light, or under the soft glow of a lamp. Your hand, perhaps a bit cramped, would guide a dip pen, requiring frequent replenishment from an inkwell. This wasn't like gliding a ballpoint across a page. The nib had to be handled with a delicate touch, just the right amount of pressure to create a smooth, unbroken line, avoiding unsightly blots or scratches. Lessons in penmanship began early in life, often with strict teachers who emphasized posture, grip, and the precise angles of each stroke. Copybooks, filled with perfect examples of cursive script, were endlessly practiced upon. You were learning to write not just legible words, but beautiful ones. A mainstream historical fact is the proliferation of copybooks and writing manuals during this period. These weren't just for children. Adults too would consult them to refine their hand. These books detailed various styles, from the elegant copperplate to the more legible round hand, each with its own specific rules for letter formation and spacing. The goal was uniformity and legibility, a clear communication that transcended individual quirks. The idea of a personal, idiosyncratic scribble was largely frowned upon. Society valued a standardized, aesthetically pleasing script. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian parents, particularly those with aspirations for their children's social advancement, would actually hire dedicated penmanship tutors for their offspring, sometimes even having them live in for intensive instruction. Imagine a tutor hovering over your shoulder for hours, correcting every flick of the wrist. This wasn't just about reading and writing, it was about cultivating an accomplishment, a visible sign of refinement. Historians still argue whether this intense focus on standardized handwriting stifled an individual creativity or if it was a necessary skill in an era before typewriters became commonplace, ensuring that messages could be universally read by anyone. Either way, it certainly made for some beautifully penned letters. The effort put into elegant handwriting meant that receiving a letter wasn't just about the news it carried, but also about appreciating the sender's effort and skill. A beautifully penned letter was a gift in itself a testament to the sender's care and respect for the recipient. It was an unspoken compliment, a visual embrace, before a single word of your actual message was even deciphered. And if your handwriting was sloppy, well, that might speak volumes too, but probably not the kind of volumes you'd want. Having meticulously chosen your stationery, painstakingly crafted your salutation, and executed your penmanship with diligent care, you might think your letter was nearly complete. But in the peculiar world of Victorian communication, there was often another layer of meaning to consider, a subtle subtext woven into the very fabric of the message, the language of flowers. Imagine not just writing words, but also sending a secret bouquet of coded meanings, understood only by those in the know. This wasn't just a pretty embellishment, it was a popular and intricate system, particularly for conveying sentiments that might be too bold or improper to express directly in words, especially in the delicate dance of courtship. A single sprig of a particular flower, or even its placement within a small illustration on the stationery itself, could speak volumes. A red rose, of course, meant passionate love, but a yellow rose, friendship, or perhaps a more hesitant affection. A sprig of rosemary symbolized remembrance, while lavender whispered of devotion. And woe betide you if you accidentally included a yellow carnation, which could mean disdain. The language of flowers, or floriography, flourished in the Victorian era, influenced by earlier Turkish and French traditions. Numerous books and dictionaries were published, eagerly consulted by young lovers and discreet friends alike, eager to decipher the hidden messages or to craft their own floral declarations. It added a layer of playful intrigue to communication, a game of veiled hints and unspoken desires. Imagine agonizing over whether to send a violet for modesty or a white lily for purity. The stakes were surprisingly high in this silent lexicon. A mainstream historical fact is that floriography became particularly popular among women, offering them a subtle and socially acceptable way to express feelings that might otherwise be deemed unladylike or forward. It provided a quiet, nuanced outlet for emotional expression within the confines of rigid Victorian social norms. It was a clandestine conversation happening right under the nose of polite society, a rebellion whispered in petals. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the way a flower was presented could also change its meaning. For example, if a flower was given upside down, its traditional meaning was reversed. If a ribbon was tied around its stem, the message was yes. If tied around the middle, no. Imagine the complexity. One wrong twist of a ribbon could send a completely unintended message. Historians still argue whether these intricate rules were universally understood or if they were more of an amusing pastime for the educated elite, a clever intellectual exercise rather than a widespread communication method. Either way, it certainly added a delightful layer of mystery to the act of sending and receiving a letter, transforming a simple piece of correspondence into a treasure hunt of meaning. So, as you penned your words, you might also be considering which small floral motif to include, or perhaps even discreetly pressing a tiny, dried flower into the fold of your letter, hoping your recipient would understand the silent poetry you were sending alongside your carefully chosen words. It was a secret language spoken in blossoms, adding a unique charm to the peculiar practices of Victorian letter writing. Your words were now flowing, perhaps with subtle floral hints, but before you could dispatch your carefully composed letter, there was one final, deeply personal touch: the sealing wax and signet. Imagine the satisfying drip of molten wax onto the folded paper, the faint scent of beeswax filling the air, followed by the decisive press of your unique signet ring or stamp. This wasn't just about securing the letter, it was about imprinting your very identity onto it, a tangible representation of your authority and privacy. Before the widespread use of envelopes, letters were simply folded and sealed directly. Even with envelopes, a wax seal added an extra layer of security and formality. It was a visual barrier against prying eyes, a promise that the contents were undisturbed. If the seal was broken, you knew your letter had been tampered with. This tactile ritual was far more engaging than a quick lick of an envelope flap. Wouldn't you agree? It transformed a simple piece of paper into a small, personalized artifact. The signet itself was often a miniature work of art. Many wealthy Victorians possessed signet rings, passed down through generations, bearing a family crest, a unique monogram, or a symbolic image. Others might have dedicated desk stamps, perhaps featuring a personalized motif. The choice of design was deeply personal, a silent declaration of who you were and what mattered to you. Imagine the quiet pride of pressing your family crest into the warm wax, knowing that this small emblem represented centuries of lineage, or perhaps a specially designed monogram, a unique artistic signature for your correspondence. A mainstream historical fact is the decline of sealing wax in everyday use paralleled the rise of mass produced envelopes with adhesive gum. As the postal system became more efficient and standardized, the elaborate ritual of sealing wax became less a necessity for privacy and more a symbol of formality or luxury. While it never completely disappeared, its ubiquitous presence in common correspondence faded, leaving it primarily for official documents or ceremonial letters. It's a classic example of how technology and efficiency can slowly erode charming, if cumbersome, traditions. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some Victorians used wafer seals, small, thin discs of edible paper, often colored, that would be moistened and pressed onto the letter, then adorned with a design pressed by a dry seal. While not as secure as wax, they offered a quicker alternative and still allowed for a personalized touch. Imagine someone inadvertently licking off a wafer seal only to discover a slightly sweet, paper like taste. Historians still argue whether the primary appeal of wafer seals was their convenience or their novelty, offering a less messy alternative to molten wax for busy writers. Either way, they show the ingenuity in finding quicker ways to add a personal flair. So, as the wax cooled and hardened, forming a perfect crisp impression of your chosen symbol, your letter was truly ready. It bore not just your words, but your personal mark, a small, elegant statement of ownership and authenticity, ready to embark on its journey through the peculiar Victorian postal network. With your letter impeccably sealed, bearing your unique mark, The next peculiar step in its journey involved a tiny, unassuming piece of paper that would revolutionize the postal system: the postage stamp. Imagine, for a moment, the shift from a system where the recipient had to pay for your letter, sometimes refusing it at the door, to one where you, the sender, could prepay its passage with a simple adhesive square. This was more than just convenience. It was a profound act of trust in a burgeoning public service. The first adhesive postage stamp, the penny black, as we briefly touched on, was issued in 1840. It featured a profile of a young Queen Victoria and was, for all its revolutionary impact, rather simple in design. But it quickly morphed into an object of fascination and, eventually, a serious hobby. The act of carefully applying this small piece of paper to the corner of your envelope became a ritual in itself, a quiet acknowledgement of the modern world catching up with the need for widespread, affordable communication. No more haggling with the postman, just stick it and send it. A mainstream historical fact is that the invention of the postage stamp not only standardized postal rates, but also made the postal service far more efficient and profitable. It created a reliable revenue stream that allowed for the expansion of routes, the hiring of more postmen, and the overall improvement of mail delivery across the British Empire. This tiny innovation had massive logistical implications, greasing the wheels of commerce and personal connection. It's truly incredible how much infrastructure grew out of that one penny. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the hobby of philately, or stamp collecting, exploded in popularity almost immediately after the introduction of stamps. People were fascinated by the different designs, the varying perforations, and the errors that inevitably crept into early printings. Imagine children and adults alike poring over magnifying glasses, meticulously organizing their collections, searching for that rare inverted image or an unusual watermark. It wasn't just a hobby. For some, it was a quiet obsession, a miniature treasure hunt on a global scale. Historians still argue whether the initial surge in stamp collecting was driven by a genuine appreciation for the artistry and historical significance of the stamps, or simply by the novelty of a new collectible fad. Either way, it certainly provided a peaceful, absorbing pastime that continues to this day. As you pressed the stamp onto your letter, perhaps moistening its gummed back with a careful lick, a common, if not entirely hygienic, practice, you were sealing its fate. This small, decorative square was its ticket to ride, ensuring its journey across towns, counties, and eventually the vast stretches of the empire. It was a tangible link in an invisible chain, carrying your words from your hand to the world beyond your parlor. Your carefully prepared letter, adorned with its newfangled postage stamp, now left the quiet confines of your writing desk and entered the bustling world of the Victorian postal system. This is where the unseen heroes, the postmen, come into play. Imagine their daily rounds, a tireless, often thankless, yet utterly essential task, rain or shine, through fog and snow. They were the veins and arteries of Victorian communication, carrying the very lifeblood of society. A mainstream historical fact is the sheer physical demands placed upon these men. Before the advent of motorized vehicles, postmen covered vast distances on foot, often multiple times a day, laden with heavy sacks of mail. Early in the Victorian era, deliveries could happen several times a day in urban centers, making the postman a familiar, even anticipated sight. Picture a postman, clad in his distinctive uniform, striding purposefully down a cobbled street, perhaps whistling a tune, his leather bag slung over his shoulder, growing lighter with each delivered letter. It was a rigorous job, requiring immense stamina and dedication, far more strenuous than slipping a few envelopes into a mailbox today. The postman's routine was a meticulous ballet of sorting, walking, and delivering. Before setting out, each letter had to be sorted by street and house number, a complex mental map of the local area. Then, the long trek began, through every kind of weather. Imagine the icy grip of a London winter or the oppressive humidity of a summer day as these men diligently completed their rounds, ensuring that news, both good and bad, reached its destination. They were the visible link between the sender and the receiver, the face of the mighty postal service. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some very observant postmen, especially in close knit communities, would often become unofficial arbiters of local gossip simply by the nature of their job. They'd notice who was sending letters to whom, who received multiple letters from the same mysterious sender, or who seemed to have a constant stream of correspondence. While discretion was certainly expected, it's not hard to imagine a quiet nod or a knowing glance that conveyed unspoken information. Historians still argue whether this informal role was a source of frustration for the Postal Service, a breach of privacy, or an inevitable side effect of a system that so intimately connected people. Either way, it certainly added a human element to the otherwise mechanical process of mail delivery. So, as your letter nestled amongst countless others in the postman's bag, it was in safe, if calloused, hands. It was part of a grander system, a testament to the organizational prowess of the Victorian age, diligently making its way to its intended recipient thanks to the quiet dedication of these unsung heroes. The postman's knock at the door, or the soft rustle of the letterbox, was a daily event filled with anticipation in a Victorian household. But the act of receiving and responding to a letter was far from a casual affair. It was imbued with social etiquette, unspoken rules, and a certain pressure to perform. Imagine the flutter of excitement, or perhaps dread, as you saw the familiar handwriting on an envelope. Upon receiving a letter, especially one of importance, the first step wasn't always to tear it open immediately. There might be a moment of contemplation, a silent assessment of the handwriting, the seal, the postage stamp itself. Opening it was a deliberate act, sometimes done privately, sometimes shared in the family circle. The content, once revealed, could bring joy, sorrow, news, or demands. And then came the crucial next step, the response. A mainstream historical fact is the expectation of prompt replies. In many social circles, it was considered rude, even insulting, to delay your response to a letter, particularly from a superior or a close acquaintance. A reply was expected within a few days, or at most a week, depending on the distance and the urgency of the message. This societal pressure meant that letter writing wasn't just a leisure activity. It was an ongoing responsibility, a constant thread in the social fabric. Imagine the guilt if you let a letter languish, unread and unanswered for too long. It's a far cry from the modern, I'll get to it later attitude towards emails. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some Victorians kept what were known as letter books or letter presses. These devices allowed them to make copies of their outgoing letters, either by transcribing them into a bound ledger or using a special press to create a damp copy on tissue paper. This was invaluable for business correspondence, but also used by individuals who wanted a record of their communications, perhaps for personal archives, or simply to remember what they had said. Imagine meticulously copying every single letter you sent. It speaks to the value placed on written communication and the desire to retain a history of conversations. Historians still argue whether this widespread practice significantly improved the efficiency of Victorian record keeping or primarily served as a testament to the era's obsession with documentation and order. Either way, it certainly made for a rather organized, if time consuming, way of managing one's correspondence. So, as you finished reading, perhaps refolding the letter along its original creases, the mental clock would start ticking. When would you find the time to gather your thoughts, select your stationery, and painstakingly craft your reply? The peculiar practices of Victorian letter writing demanded not just your words, but your time, your etiquette, and your unwavering commitment to the intricate dance of communication. Among all the peculiar practices of Victorian letter writing, none was perhaps more fraught with unspoken rules and heart fluttering anticipation than the love letter. Imagine the delicate dance, the subtle hints, the agonizing over every carefully chosen word as you penned a message that might determine the course of your romantic future. This wasn't a casual swipe right. This was a calculated, deeply personal investment in a potential courtship. Love letters in the Victorian era were often an intricate blend of formality and passionate sentiment. You couldn't just blurt out your feelings. Instead, you would likely begin with the expected formal salutation, perhaps, my dear Miss Name, even if your heart was pounding. Then, through carefully constructed sentences laden with poetic metaphor and perhaps a hint of classical allusion, you would gradually reveal your admiration, your respect, and eventually your burgeoning affection. It was a slow reveal, building suspense with every line, ensuring propriety was maintained even as emotions soared. The paper itself might be perfumed, a subtle scent lingering as an ethereal reminder of the sender. A mainstream historical fact is that courtship in the Victorian era was heavily chaperoned and often involved limited direct interaction between unmarried men and women. This made letter writing absolutely crucial for developing intimacy and expressing feelings that couldn't be spoken aloud in polite company. The love letter became a private sanctuary, a clandestine space where souls could meet, shielded from societal gaze. It was a lifeline for budding romances, allowing individuals to truly get to know each other's minds and hearts before physical intimacy or even extended private conversation was permitted. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some very earnest Victorian suitors would actually employ professional letter writers if they felt their own prose wasn't eloquent enough to win the object of their affection. Imagine commissioning someone else to write your declarations of undying love. While this might seem disingenuous to us, in an era where eloquence was highly prized, it could be seen as a practical means to ensure one presented their best possible self, even if it was a ghost written one. Historians still argue whether these ghost written love letters were widely accepted as genuine expressions of affection, or if they were seen as a somewhat cynical, if practical, approach to courtship. Either way, it certainly adds a layer of delightful oddness to the pursuit of love. As you reread your carefully crafted phrases, perhaps visualizing the recipient's delicate blush as they absorbed your words, you knew the stakes were high. A single line could convey hope, or perhaps accidental offense. The peculiar practices of Victorian love letters were a testament to the power of the written word, capable of igniting passion and forging connections, all within the strict confines of a highly structured society. While love letters shimmered with romantic potential, other forms of correspondence in Victorian society carried the heavy weight of sorrow and shared grief. The letters of condolence. Imagine the delicate balance required, the profound empathy needed to craft a message that offered comfort without seeming intrusive, acknowledging loss without dwelling unnecessarily on pain. This was a challenging, yet essential, form of communication, a testament to the Victorian commitment to social graces even in the face of immense sadness. When someone suffered a bereavement, the outpouring of letters from friends, family, and acquaintances was often immense. These weren't quick texts or emails. Each one was a carefully considered piece of writing intended to provide solace and express genuine sympathy. You wouldn't just scribble a few lines, you would deliberate over every phrase, ensuring it conveyed respect for the deceased and sincere support for the bereaved. The paper itself might be somber, perhaps edged in black, setting a tone of solemnity before a single word was read. A mainstream historical fact is the highly ritualized nature of Victorian mourning practices. Widows, for example, were expected to observe strict periods of mourning, often wearing black for years. Letters of condolence played a crucial role in acknowledging and supporting individuals through these rites. They were a visible sign that the community recognized the loss and stood in solidarity with the grieving, a social safety net woven from ink and paper. It was a societal expectation to offer comfort in this manner, a duty as much as a heartfelt gesture. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some formal letters of condolence would arrive accompanied by a sympathy card, a precursor to modern greeting cards, often featuring embossed designs like weeping willows, angels, or doves, and sometimes pre-printed verses of comfort. Imagine receiving a card with an image of a somber cherub tucked within a hand-penned letter of sorrow. These cards offered a structured way to express feelings that might be difficult to articulate personally, providing a dignified and appropriate outlet for grief. Historians still argue whether the popularity of these pre-printed sympathy cards represented a genuine desire for comfort or a slight decline in the art of personal expression, offering a convenient, rather than deeply felt form of commiseration. Either way, they certainly made the act of expressing sympathy a standardized, yet still poignant endeavor. So, as you dipped your pen, choosing your words with painstaking care, you understood the gravity of the task. You were not just writing, you were reaching out across the chasm of loss, offering a quiet, comforting hand through the peculiar yet profound practice of Victorian condolence letters. Beyond the personal sentiments of love and loss, Victorian letters served as the indispensable backbone of commerce, governance, and every aspect of public life. Imagine the sheer volume of business and official mail flowing through the postal system daily. This wasn't just about social niceties, it was about the very machinery of society churning along, driven by the written word. Whether it was a merchant ordering goods from a supplier, a solicitor communicating with a client, a government office issuing a decree, or a distant colonial administrator sending reports back to London, these formal letters were the lifeblood of operations. They were characterized by their precision, their often stiff formality, and their absolute requirement for clarity. There was no room for ambiguity when contracts, shipments, or legal matters were at stake. You would likely use specific, often pre printed letterheads for your business, lending an air of professionalism and authority. The ink would be crisp, the handwriting legible, and every date and reference meticulously noted. A mainstream historical fact is that the rapid expansion of global trade and the British Empire during the Victorian era was heavily reliant on an efficient postal service for official communication. Without reliable mail, coordinating vast networks of commerce, managing colonies, and administering laws across continents would have been virtually impossible. The mail ship was as crucial as the telegraph in linking distant parts of the world, making decisions and enforcing policies. It truly highlights how central the postal system was to the era's global reach. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some very busy Victorian businessmen and officials would employ specialized letter copying machines, which before the advent of carbon paper, used a damp tissue paper to create a faint reverse image of an outgoing letter. Imagine pressing your important business letter onto a damp sheet to make a copy. It was a messy but effective way to keep records of correspondence, vital for tracking agreements and transactions. Historians still argue whether the complexity of operating these machines often outweighed their benefits for smaller enterprises, or if they were an indispensable tool for large scale operations. Either way, they certainly speak to the Victorian drive for meticulous record keeping and efficiency, even when the technology was rudimentary. So, as you penned a formal request, signed off on an important invoice, or drafted a diplomatic dispatch, you were participating in the grand, unseen current of Victorian officialdom. These weren't the letters that tugged at the heartstrings, but they were the ones that kept the entire, sprawling machine of the empire running, one precisely worded missive at a time. In stark contrast to the formal exchanges of business and the tender sentiments of love, there existed a very specific and rather somber category of Victorian stationery, the mourning card. Imagine the subtle yet unmistakable visual cue, the quiet declaration of grief conveyed through the very paper you held. This wasn't just a letter, it was a physical manifestation of loss, a widely understood signal of recent bereavement. Mourning cards and stationery became increasingly prevalent throughout the Victorian era, reaching their peak during Queen Victoria's own prolonged mourning for Prince Albert. These were not typically used for casual correspondence. Instead, they served a very specific purpose: to announce a death, invite mourners to a funeral, or to respond to expressions of condolence. You would immediately recognize these cards by their distinctive black borders. The width of the border often indicated the closeness of your relationship to the deceased and the stage of mourning. A wide, heavy black border signified deep, immediate grief, often for a spouse or a parent, while narrower borders might be used for more distant relatives or later stages of mourning. A mainstream historical fact here is how deeply ingrained and publicly displayed mourning rituals were in Victorian society. Mourning was not a private affair, it was a visible performance, dictated by strict social codes. The use of specific mourning stationery was a key component of this public display, signaling one's status as a bereaved individual to everyone who received their correspondence. It was a visual shorthand for grief, instantly communicating a somber context for any message contained within. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some very particular individuals, especially women, would keep an entire separate set of mourning stationery in their writing desks, ready for immediate use should news of a death arrive. Imagine the foresight, or perhaps the morbid preparedness, of having specialized black edged paper and envelopes tucked away for just such an eventuality. This wasn't merely practical, it was a testament to the pervasive nature of mourning etiquette, or even your writing supplies needed to reflect the gravity of the occasion. Historians still argue whether the elaborate and extensive nature of Victorian mourning rituals, including the use of specific stationery, helped individuals process grief or merely imposed a rigid, sometimes stifling, set of external behaviors. Either way, it certainly made for a peculiar and visually striking aspect of Victorian correspondence. So, as you received or dispatched a letter edged in black, you were participating in a silent, collective ritual of remembrance and respect, acknowledging the ever present shadow of mortality that wove through the peculiar practices of Victorian life and letter writing. Before the ink could even flow onto the mourning card or the love letter, the very setting for this intricate act of writing played a significant role: the writing desk and parlor scene. Imagine yourself in a typical Victorian home, perhaps the drawing room or a dedicated study, where the act of correspondence was often a serene, almost meditative activity. This wasn't a quick jot on a phone while standing on a bus. It was an established ritual that required its own dedicated space. The writing desk itself was often a substantial piece of furniture, crafted from dark, polished wood like mahogany or walnut. It might feature numerous small drawers for stationery, a sloping top that could be raised for comfortable writing, and perhaps an integrated inkwell and pen rest. Imagine the satisfaction of opening a secret compartment, revealing a stash of personal papers or a hidden pot of sealing wax. This wasn't just a surface, it was a personal command center for communication, a microcosm of the ordered Victorian mind. The desk would be meticulously arranged. You'd find a neat stack of various papers and envelopes, perhaps a collection of different colored inks, blotting paper to absorb excess ink, and a pen wiper. The lighting would be crucial, a tall window providing natural daylight, or in the evening, the soft, flickering glow of a gas lamp or a candle casting long shadows across the page. This ambiance encouraged contemplation and precision, fostering the very essence of careful communication. It's a far cry from typing on a bright screen in a noisy coffee shop, isn't it? A mainstream historical fact is that the rise of the middle class in the Victorian era led to a greater emphasis on domestic comfort and specialized furniture. The writing desk, often a central feature of the parlor or study, symbolized gentility, education, and the intellectual pursuits of the household. It was a space where ideas were formed, connections were forged, and the family's intellectual life often unfolded. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some very elaborate Victorian writing desks included hidden mechanisms or secret drawers, not just for privacy, but as a playful design element. Imagine discovering a spring loaded compartment or a sliding panel that revealed a hidden space for illicit love letters or confidential documents. These secret features added a layer of intrigue to the furniture itself, transforming a functional object into a silent confidant. Historians still argue whether the popularity of these hidden compartments reflected a genuine need for secrecy in a more public society, or merely a fascination with mechanical ingenuity and clever design. Either way, it certainly made the act of writing a letter feel like an adventure. So, as you settled into your chair at such a desk, surrounded by the quiet hum of a Victorian home, you were not just writing words. You were participating in a deeply entrenched cultural practice, framed by the very furniture and atmosphere that defined the peculiar elegance of the era. As you continued to craft your letters, perhaps even from a desk with hidden compartments, you might occasionally find yourself wanting to share information that was either too sensitive for casual perusal or simply meant only for the eyes of the intended recipient. This is where the peculiar practice of secret ciphers entered the Victorian correspondence world. Imagine weaving a hidden message within plain sight, a linguistic puzzle only a select few could unlock. While not as common as everyday correspondence, the use of simple codes and ciphers did exist, especially among close friends, lovers, or in situations where privacy was paramount. These weren't typically the complex, military grade encryption systems we think of today, but rather more rudimentary methods designed to deter casual eavesdropping. A common technique might involve an agreed upon substitution, where each letter of the alphabet stood for another, or perhaps a keyword that dictated the shifting of letters. Imagine carefully writing out a sentence, then subtly altering it, knowing that only your confidant would understand its true meaning. It added a delightful layer of intrigue to the act of communication. A mainstream historical fact is that while advanced cryptography was largely the domain of government and military intelligence, simpler ciphers and coded messages had a long history in personal correspondence, particularly among those who valued privacy or shared illicit information. The Victorian era, with its rigid social norms, might have encouraged such subtle forms of subversion, allowing individuals to express themselves more freely in coded language than they could in plain text. It was a silent rebellion, whispered in jumbled letters. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some Victorians would use a simple grill cipher, a piece of cardboard or paper with strategically cut out windows. When placed over a seemingly innocuous letter, only the words visible through the cutouts would form the actual hidden message. Imagine a letter that reads like a polite social update, but when viewed through a special grill, it reveals a scandalous secret or a passionate declaration. This method allowed for both a public and a private message to coexist on the same page, offering plausible deniability if the letter fell into the wrong hands. Historians still argue whether the complexity of creating and distributing these custom grills made them impractical for widespread use, or if they were a rare but highly effective tool for clandestine communication among a select few. Either way, it certainly made for a fascinating double life for a single piece of paper. So, as you pinned your letter, you might have considered if a layer of hidden meaning was truly necessary. If so, you'd carefully construct your words, perhaps with a secret code in mind, knowing that only the intended reader, armed with the key, would truly unlock its peculiar message. Life in the Victorian era, for all its advances, was still often touched by illness and infirmity. When sickness struck, the peculiar practice of illness and invalid letters became a crucial lifeline, connecting the ailing with the outside world and offering comfort to anxious loved ones. Imagine lying in a dimly lit room, perhaps feeling quite unwell, but still compelled by social expectation or genuine desire to communicate. These letters carried a unique tone. They might be filled with updates on symptoms, descriptions of treatments, some of which were quite questionable by modern standards, and expressions of hope for recovery. For the invalid, writing a letter could be a momentous effort, each sentence penned with a conscious exertion of strength. For the recipient, such a letter was read with a mix of dread and anticipation, searching for any sign of improvement or decline. Friends and family would also send letters to the invalid, filled with encouraging words, news from the outside world, and assurances of their thoughts and prayers. A mainstream historical fact is the significant impact of infectious diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, and typhoid during the Victorian era. These illnesses often led to prolonged periods of confinement and isolation, making letters an indispensable tool for maintaining social connections and managing affairs from a sickbed. Without video calls or instant messaging, the written word was often the only link to loved ones when separation was enforced by illness. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some Victorian invalids, too weak to hold a pen themselves, would dictate their letters to a family member or a hired scribe. These dictated letters sometimes offered a fascinating glimpse into the unfiltered thoughts of the ailing, as the struggle to articulate might lead to more direct or poignant expressions than a carefully composed written letter. Imagine the challenges of dictating your symptoms or your deepest fears, word by painstaking word, to another person. Historians still argue whether these dictated letters were truly authentic reflections of the invalid's mind or if the scribe's presence inevitably shaped the tone and content, perhaps softening grim realities or adding a touch of polite Victorian euphemism. Either way, they certainly highlight the lengths people went to in order to communicate during times of vulnerability. So, as you read or wrote an illness letter, you were participating in a profound act of human connection across the divides of health and sickness, a peculiar testament to the enduring power of the written word in even the most delicate of circumstances. For the Victorian traveler, whether on a grand tour of Europe or a brief excursion to a seaside resort, the urge to communicate back home remained strong. This gave rise to the peculiar practices surrounding travel letters and early postcards. Imagine sending a snippet of your journey across vast distances, capturing a moment, a sight, a fleeting thought, and dispatching it for your loved ones to ponder. Before the true postcard, travelers would often write letters on specially designed, often thinner paper, sometimes even with pre-printed images or maps as borders, to save on postage. These were known as morning stationery with scenery. Though that sounds a bit morbid, it just means they were visually appealing. They were often packed with vivid descriptions of sights seen, local customs observed, and the inevitable complaints about food or lodging. Receiving such a letter was like a miniature adventure in itself, allowing those back home to vicariously experience the exotic or unfamiliar. It was a tangible link to a world beyond their immediate surroundings, a far cry from today's instant photo uploads. A mainstream historical fact is the significant increase in travel, both for leisure and business, during the Victorian era, fueled by improvements in transportation like railways and steamships. This burgeoning mobility directly contributed to the demand for efficient and affordable ways to communicate from afar, making travel letters and their eventual evolution into postcards a vital part of connecting distant worlds. It highlights how interconnected progress in different sectors truly is. Now for a quirky tidbit. The very earliest forms of postcards were often simple, government issued cards, typically with a pre printed stamp on which you could only write a very brief message. Personal pictures on postcards didn't become widely popular until later in the era. Imagine trying to summarize your entire European adventure in just a few lines on a plain card. This brevity forced a peculiar conciseness, a distillation of experience into its most essential, bite sized components. Historians still argue whether the initial plainness of early postcards was due to technological limitations or a deliberate attempt by postal authorities to keep them purely functional, resisting the frivolity of images. Either way, it certainly made for a rather austere form of travel communication, prioritizing speed over visual flair. So, as you scrawled a quick note from Paris or penned a longer missive from the depths of India, your travel letter was a testament to the Victorian spirit of exploration and connection, carrying not just words, but the very essence of your journey across oceans and continents. While adults meticulously crafted their correspondence, the Victorian era also saw the delightful and often peculiar development of children's letters. Imagine a small, earnest hand gripping a pen, struggling to form legible letters, eager to communicate with a grandparent or a distant sibling. These letters offer a charming glimpse into the developing minds and innocent perspectives of Victorian youth. Children, particularly those in middle and upper class families, were typically taught penmanship and letter writing etiquette from a young age. It was considered an essential skill, not just for communication, but as a marker of good breeding and education. Their early letters might be simple, dictated to a governess or parent, but as they grew, their own distinct voices would emerge, often with charming misspellings and endearing grammatical quirks. These letters often contained updates on their studies, descriptions of toys, tales of pets, or perhaps a plaintive request for sweets or a new book. A mainstream historical fact is the increasing emphasis on childhood education during the Victorian period, which included instruction in writing and composition. As literacy rates generally rose, so too did the expectation that children would be able to communicate effectively in writing, paving the way for a generation more connected by the written word. This wasn't just about practical skills, it was about nurturing the next generation of literate citizens. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian children's letters were written with a surprisingly formal tone, mirroring the adult correspondence they observed around them. Imagine a child signing off a letter to their grandmother with "your obedient servant." It speaks to the pervasive influence of Victorian social norms, even on the youngest members of society. However, interspersed with this formality, you often find moments of pure, unadulterated childlike joy or frustration, making these letters a fascinating blend of imposed etiquette and genuine youthful spirit. Historians still argue whether this early imposition of formal writing styles stifled children's natural creativity or provided a necessary foundation for clear and structured communication later in life. Either way, it certainly made for some adorably stiff, yet ultimately charming, pieces of correspondence. So, as you read a child's careful scrawl, perhaps a drawing of a dog tucked into the folds, you could almost hear the earnest voice behind the words, a peculiar and heartwarming echo from the past, demonstrating that even the youngest Victorians embraced the power of the written word. Sometimes, despite all the meticulous planning and heartfelt effort, a letter was never sent. This leads us to the peculiar concept of the unsent letter in the Victorian era. Imagine pouring your heart out onto paper, perhaps in a fit of emotion, only to later reconsider and tuck the letter away, destined never to reach its intended recipient. These silent missives offer a fascinating glimpse into the inner lives and unspoken thoughts of Victorians. An unsent letter might be a passionate declaration of love, deemed too forward, a furious retort to an insult that was later swallowed, or a confession of a secret too dangerous to reveal. It wasn't about the act of communication, but the act of composition itself, a way to process emotions, articulate arguments, or simply vent frustrations without the consequences of actual dispatch. The words were written, the feelings expressed, but the physical act of sending was withheld, leaving the letter in a kind of limbo, a private echo of a conversation that never happened. Think of it as a very elaborate, physical diary entry that you just almost mailed. A mainstream historical fact is the prevalence of strict social decorum in Victorian society, which often compelled individuals to suppress strong emotions or unconventional thoughts. The unsent letter provided a vital outlet for these suppressed feelings, allowing individuals to articulate sentiments that would be deemed inappropriate or scandalous in public discourse or even in a sent letter. It served as a therapeutic exercise, a safe space for thoughts that couldn't otherwise be aired. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian diarists would occasionally include copies or drafts of unsent letters within their journals, often with annotations explaining why they chose not to send them. Imagine reading a diary entry that says, drafted a scathing reply to Aunt Mildred, but decided against sending it. Better to keep the peace, though the urge was strong. These entries provide invaluable insights into the social pressures and personal dilemmas faced by Victorians, offering a window into their decision making process. Historians still argue whether the act of writing an unsent letter provided true emotional catharsis or merely served as a temporary psychological pressure release, with the underlying issues remaining unresolved. Either way, it certainly made for a rich, if sometimes frustrating, historical record for future researchers. So, as you reflect on these peculiar, unspoken communications, you realize that even the absence of a journey, the silence of a letter tucked away in a drawer, can speak volumes about the peculiar and complex inner world of the Victorians. Even if a letter was carefully penned and dutifully sent, its journey wasn't always as private as the sender intended. This brings us to the sometimes unsettling reality of censorship and prying eyes in the Victorian postal system. Imagine the uncomfortable thought that your carefully chosen words might not only be read by their intended recipient, but also by an unwelcome third party. While not as widespread as in totalitarian regimes, a degree of official and unofficial surveillance did exist. During wartime, for instance, letters might be opened and read by authorities to check for seditious content or military intelligence. This was a common practice during conflicts like the Crimean War, where information traveling by post could have strategic implications. Imagine a soldier's heartfelt letter home being scrutinized by a censor, every word weighed for its potential to reveal secrets. A more common form of prying eyes, however, was less official and more domestic. In many Victorian households, particularly those with strict parents or guardians, children's or young women's correspondence might be routinely inspected. This wasn't about state security, but about maintaining moral rectitude and control. Parents might intercept letters from unsuitable suitors or monitor correspondence to ensure their children were not engaging in improper behavior. The sense of a letter being a truly private communication was often an illusion, especially for those under the authority of others. A mainstream historical fact is the gradual development of legal frameworks around postal privacy. While government interception was possible, public outcry and legal challenges slowly pushed towards greater protection for private correspondence over the course of the century, though such protections were never absolute. The very idea of a sealed letter became increasingly synonymous with privacy as the century progressed, even if the reality sometimes fell short. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian letter writers, aware of potential prying eyes, would resort to writing in a form of cross writing or cross hatching. This involved writing a message in one direction on a sheet of paper, then turning the paper 90 degrees and writing another message over the first, creating a grid of overlapping lines of text. Imagine trying to decipher that. It was done to save on paper and thus postage, especially before the penny post, but it also made casual reading incredibly difficult, acting as a rudimentary, albeit frustrating, privacy measure. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for cross writing was economic necessity or an intentional, if clumsy, attempt at privacy in an era where paper was a commodity and private space was sometimes scarce. Either way, it certainly made for a peculiar and eye straining reading experience. So, as your letter made its way through the Victorian world, you might have held a quiet hope that its contents remained sacred and unread by unintended audiences, a peculiar challenge to privacy in an era without digital firewalls. While you were busy perfecting your penmanship and sealing your letters, a vast, invisible army was working tirelessly to make the entire system function, the Postal Service as employer. Imagine hundreds of thousands of individuals, from sorting clerks to delivery postmen, all part of a colossal organization dedicated solely to moving paper from one hand to another. This wasn't just a convenience, it was a major industry and a significant source of employment in Victorian Britain. The sheer scale of the Victorian Postal Service was immense. It was one of the largest employers in the country, offering stable, if sometimes physically demanding, work to countless men and, eventually, a growing number of women. From the bustling sorting offices in major cities, where letters were rapidly categorized and bagged, to the rural post offices, often run by a single postmistress in a small village, the network was pervasive. Each cog in this enormous machine played a vital role in ensuring your letter reached its destination. A mainstream historical fact is that the General Post Office, GPO, was a pioneering organization in many aspects of public service. It was among the first to offer pensions to its employees, provide uniforms, and establish clear hierarchical structures, making it a model for other large governmental departments. It wasn't just about delivering mail, it was about building a reliable, professional workforce capable of handling a constantly increasing volume of communication. Now for a quirky tidbit. The GPO even had its own dedicated post office savings bank, established in 1861. This allowed ordinary people, particularly those in rural areas with limited access to traditional banks, to deposit small sums of money at their local post office. Imagine trusting your life savings to the very same counter where you bought your stamps. It blurred the lines between postal service and financial institution, offering a surprising level of public trust and convenience. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for the post office savings bank was to provide a vital public service to the underserved or if it was also a clever way for the government to raise capital through public deposits. Either way, it certainly made the local post office far more than just a place to send a letter, turning it into a financial hub for the working class. So, as your letter sped on its way, remember the vast, unseen workforce behind the scenes, the dedicated individuals who ensured that the peculiar practices of Victorian letter writing could flourish, connecting millions across an ever expanding world. Despite the meticulous efforts of postmen and the vast organization behind them, sometimes letters just didn't make it. This brings us to the curious fate of lost letters and dead letter offices in the Victorian era. Imagine sending a heartfelt message only for it to disappear into the ether, never reaching its destination. It was a postal purgatory, a place where undeliverable mail went to languish. A letter could get lost for a myriad of reasons: an incorrect address, a damaged stamp, insufficient postage, or simply falling out of a postman's bag. When a letter couldn't be delivered, it wasn't just thrown away. Instead, it was sent to a specialized department known as the Dead Letter Office, DLO. Here, dedicated clerks would meticulously attempt to trace the sender or the intended recipient, poring over the handwriting, searching for any clue that might lead them to its rightful owner. It was a painstaking, often frustrating, but vital task. Think of it as the ultimate lost and found for paper, but with far higher stakes than a misplaced umbrella. A mainstream historical fact is that dead letter offices actually managed to return a surprisingly high percentage of undeliverable mail. These offices often contained bizarre and fascinating contents, ranging from personal letters to forgotten wills and even uncashed checks. The GPO recognized the importance of connecting people with their mail, even when the initial attempt failed, reflecting a strong commitment to public service. Now for a quirky tidbit. Dead letter offices sometimes held letters that contained extremely valuable items, inadvertently left in the mail. Imagine a clerk opening a lost letter only to find a diamond ring, a wad of cash, or even important legal documents. These items would be meticulously cataloged and held, awaiting reclamation. Historians still argue whether the dedicated efforts to reunite lost valuables with their owners were purely a matter of public duty or if they also served to build public trust in the postal service, encouraging people to use it for all sorts of important communications. Either way, it certainly made the dead letter office a place of quiet intrigue, a repository of untold stories and unexpected treasures. So, as your carefully crafted letter made its way through the Victorian postal system, you hoped it wouldn't end up in the peculiar limbo of the dead letter office, a silent testament to the challenges and occasional failures of even the most sophisticated communication networks of the past. As we gently drift through the peculiar practices of Victorian letter writing, it becomes clear that these seemingly quaint habits have an enduring legacy that shaped our modern communication landscape in profound ways. Imagine how different our world would be today if these foundational steps hadn't been taken. The penny post. Remember that game changer from Section 2? It wasn't just about sending letters for a penny. It established the principle of universal service, of affordable and reliable communication for everyone, regardless of their location or social standing. This idea that communication is a public good underpins everything from our modern postal systems to the very notion of accessible internet. You can trace a direct line from Rowland Hill's reform to the idea that everyone should have equal access to connect with one another. It was a societal leveling of the communication playing field. A mainstream historical fact here is the way the Victorian postal system laid the groundwork for complex logistical networks that would later support other forms of communication. The routes, the sorting systems, the large workforce, all these infrastructures were adaptable. When the telegraph arrived, it often piggybacked on existing postal routes and offices. Later, telephone lines and even early internet infrastructure would benefit from the precedent of widespread connectivity established by the mail. The physical delivery of letters built the metaphorical roads for all future information highways. Now, for a quirky tidbit, the Victorian era's obsession with letter writing also inadvertently contributed to the early development of typing schools and secretarial professions. As the volume of mail increased, especially business correspondence, the need for faster, more legible methods of documentation became apparent. The eventual widespread adoption of typewriters and the creation of jobs for typists can be seen as a direct evolutionary step from the meticulous demands of Victorian penmanship. Imagine the transition from carefully dipping a pen to the clatter of keys. Historians still argue whether the invention of the typewriter was a natural progression from the need for more efficient writing or if it significantly altered the very nature of written expression, moving from personal artistry to mechanical uniformity. Either way, it certainly marked a pivotal shift in the tools of communication. So, while we might chuckle at the thought of hidden compartments or the language of flowers, the peculiar practices of Victorian letter writing gifted us with fundamental concepts of connectivity, accessibility, and the very infrastructure upon which our instantaneous digital world now stands. As the ink of our journey slowly fades, just like the faint sepia tones on an aged Victorian letter, we arrive at the quiet contemplation of fading ink, fading light. Imagine the very last moments of your day, the gentle easing of the mind, as the subtle echoes of these historical practices whisper through your thoughts. The meticulous rituals of Victorian letter writing, from the selection of exquisite paper to the sealing of wax, the anticipation of the postman's knock, and the quiet joy or sorrow of a received message, were deeply embedded in the rhythm of daily life. They required patience, precision, and a profound appreciation for the written word. In an age devoid of instant communication, each letter was a precious artifact, a tangible link across distances, often carried by hand and heart over great lengths of time. As the gaslight in our imaginary parlor dims to a soft glow, consider the lives that unfolded around these letters. The secrets they held, the loves they nurtured, the businesses they built, and the grief they comforted. Each one was a testament to human connection, meticulously crafted, silently conveyed, and patiently awaited. They were not just words on paper, they were fragments of lives, echoes of voices, preserved through the peculiar alchemy of ink and time. The very slowness of the process forced a deeper engagement, a more considered thought. You couldn't just fire off an angry missive and regret it a second later. The time it took to write, address, and dispatch a letter offered a natural cooling off period, a chance for reflection that we rarely afford ourselves today. This deliberate pace, this gentle cadence, is perhaps the most soothing legacy of all. As you drift now, imagine the gentle scratch of a quill, the soft rustle of aged paper, the distant clip-clop of a horse in the quiet street, the weight of an unopened letter in your hand, pregnant with possibility, the warmth of a wax seal, broken to reveal secrets or solace. These peculiar practices, once the heartbeat of an entire era, now serve as a soft lullaby, inviting you to let your own thoughts slow, your breath deepen, and your mind settle into the quiet calm of history.